he introduced me to some people I hadn't known before, Martha Bayless being one of them. I said, we really need to have a chapter on culture. And he said, she's the one. And I had read some of her work in the New Republic on jazz, but I had never met her, and that too was a very happy collaboration. And I'll say one other thing. I introduced him to some people he had not known, and one of them was Josef Joffe, the German journalist. And I commend Joffe's chapter in our book very strongly to those of you who don't know his work. It's a European's view of American exceptionalism. Very provocative, very well written. So any discussion of exceptionalism has to begin with Tocqueville, and Tocqueville thought that we were exceptional very early on, but mainly because we had produced what he called an eminently democratic polity, and in conditions of general equality of circumstances. He thought that was what was really unusual about the United States, and of course at that period of time it was unprecedented. Since then, and most recently, the objections to the notion of American exceptionalism have proliferated. There are objections in general, which is, I think, a kind of manifestation of the idea, which has many other implications for many people, that we are all the same, that everybody's the same, and everything is relative along a very similar dimension. As applied to the United States, it has been criticized in a number of ways, and I want to read from our discussion in our introduction to the book, just very briefly, a couple of passages which I think capture this and capture Jim's approach to this. Americans may proudly think of their nation as exceptional, but many foreigners roll their eyes and complain that Americans often deviate from the democratic ideal. To them, Americans are exceptional, all right, exceptionally vulgar, exceptionally materialistic, exceptionally imperialistic, exceptionally clumsy, exceptionally unfeeling, and exceptionally self-centered. Now, Jim and I felt very strongly that this was wrong, and we wanted to make exceptionalism part of the theme of the book, and it's part of the subtitle of the book. I have very little doubt that Jim went so far as to be a chauvinist, which is not the same thing as being an exceptionalist. Although I imagine that he was a critical and non-jingo chauvinist. And again, that's my position. So we were very compatible in that respect. So I thought I would spend just a minute or two raising some questions about exceptionalism in general before moving on to the claims we make about exceptionalism in the book. First, the claim of American exceptionalism raises many interesting questions of a conceptual, definitional, empirical, and normative nature. If every country, every culture, every individual is exceptional, then is the claim of exceptionalism anodyne and meaningless? Is there a spectrum of specialness? So I identify, just for purposes of provocation, 4 different points on this spectrum. One is difference, the second is distinctiveness, the third is exceptionality, and the fourth is uniqueness. So when we're discussing exceptionalism, it's important to be clear about where we are on that spectrum, and consider whether it's intelligible to say that even if all countries, cultures, individuals are exceptional, can it be said that one country or culture or individual is more exceptional than another? I think so, and again, I think I have little doubt that Jim felt that all countries are exceptional, but the United States is more exceptional than most, or perhaps any other. And we conceived this book as a way of exploring or sustaining that claim. Of course, one wants to know along which dimensions the claim of exceptionality applies. Political system, culture, civil society institutions. And again, I think we concluded that American exceptionalism applies across all of those dimensions and others. And then there's the question of the normative valence of the claim of exceptionalism. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it good in some respects, bad in others? And of course, what do we mean by good and bad in these respects? So this is what we concluded in general about exceptionalism, and then I'll just spend a couple of minutes being a bit more particularistic in describing its elements. Again, this is from the introduction to the book. Beneath the surface, these complaints, the ones that I read earlier, these complaints sometimes seem unduly harsh. After all, Americans may be vulgar, but our music, books, and films dominate the global cultural market, and not just at the low end. Americans may be materialistic, but our material goods, blue jeans, iPods, and computer programs, are equally consumed everywhere. American may seem imperialistic, but most of the people in Europe, Bosnia, Kosovo, Kuwait, Taiwan, Israel, and Iraq wanted to be assured that in their hour of need, American military might was available to help them. Americans may be clumsy, but a superpower seeking to pacify a convulsive, often hostile world is bound to stumble at times. Americans may prefer a welfare state more limited than Europe's, but they are extraordinarily philanthropic toward the poor. Americans may be self-absorbed, but who isn't? So we identified 7 general aspects of American exceptionalism, and I'll just, as I say, I'll touch on them very, very briefly. The first is culture, and we identified 4 elements of culture that Jim was particularly keen to isolate and focus on these. The first being patriotism. He emphasized that 71% of Americans claim that they're very proud to be Americans, whereas about half that percentage of French people will say the same thing. Individualism is the second element of the culture. 1/3 of Americans believe that success depends upon forces outside their control, whereas 2/3 of French, Germans, Italians, other Europeans have the same view. And of course, individualism affects everything in government, and this theme carries through in our individual chapters where we looked at specific policy areas or cultural domains. Third element of the culture that we saw as exceptional was its religiosity, at least in the Western world. The great reform movements that have marked American life and have made America a progressive force in the world stem from religious movements. Immigration has invigorated religion, even as religion has played an extremely important role in integrating immigrants into our culture. And Jim was very keen on the idea that one of the important features of American religion that marks it in sharp distinction to religion in other societies is how competitive it is. He believed the vitality of American religion depended to a very considerable extent on the extent to which competitive ideas, marketing, and defining the market in a variety of ways was an important reason for the schismatics of American religious history, but also of its widespread influence in American life. The second exceptional feature of American life we thought was constitutionalism, and I don't think I'll have any more to say about that. I think we all know what that referred to. The third was the economy. And we pointed out that in no other country in the world has there been such a sustained record of growth, of job creation, of innovation, of capital investment, and the widespread distribution of ownership of enterprise. A fourth dimension was diversity. And more than diversity, because the United States is the most diverse society in the world, with the possible exception of India. If any of you have been in India as I have, you will appreciate that even our diversity is dwarfed by theirs. But certainly the most diverse industrialized society. And what's striking about our diversity in this respect is that it's been coupled with an extraordinary stability for more than 200 years, interrupted, to be sure, by violence and discrimination and many incidents that we best put behind us, but by any relative standards, stability indeed. The fifth element was civil society, which is, in the United States, extraordinarily robust in every respect, but with one important exception, which I'll come to in a moment, which again Jim was we were both very keen to emphasize. The sixth element is the welfare state, especially the reliance in the United States on private provision through off-budget subsidies and through federal and state programs, and of course through private philanthropy. And the last one we emphasized was demography. Not simply the fertility rates that characterize the United States in contradistinction to other Western societies, which stabilized somewhat since we wrote this, but that may be just a blip. And one thing you should understand if you read in demography is that demographers are almost always wrong. They almost always fail to predict the actual trajectory of population trends. And the fertility of the United States population has been generated to a great extent by immigration, but also by optimism and future orientation in our population. Again, aspects of the demographic picture that Jim wanted to emphasize. Now, the big exception, which he and I both felt needed to be marked in the book, was the family, particularly in low-income populations, the non-formation of families, the dissolution of families, and so forth. Linda McLean is going to talk about that later on, so I won't say more about that. But so American exceptionalism on the whole has been an extraordinarily good, rich, ennobling, encouraging set of developments. But in this respect, we've been exceptional failures. And of course, the question is, what do we do about that? Jim had some ideas about that. I don't have any good ideas about that, because it seems to me one of the areas, perhaps the area of social reality that is least tractable to public policy. But anyway, why don't I stop there?
We'll have time for questions, but after our second speaker. We're also fortunate that Hugh Heclo answered that same existential question affirmatively in the last 10 years. Last 10 years he's written Christianity and American Government, the DeMuth lectures, and on thinking institutionally. And when I spoke of Peter collaborating with Jim, I did not note that Jim's collaborators were a small but very distinguished group, ranging from Ed Banfield to John DeMuth, through Peter, George Keller, Mark Moore, and forgive me if I've left others in this fine group out that did collaborate with Jim. And of course, this distinguished group includes Hugh, with whom Jim collaborated in teaching. For several years in the early 1980s, Hugh and Jim co-taught Harvard's introductory course in American Government. According to Hugh's own account, and I want to stress this as the source, because it tells us a lot about Hugh's modesty. According to his own account, Hugh distinguished himself by rejecting Jim's suggestion that it might make sense to write a textbook on that subject. According to Hugh, who's counted this, the Wilson DiIulio classic textbook on American government is now, many royalty checks later, in its 13th or 14th edition. You have
I'm afraid that's true. Don't worry about all the papers. If this talk's any good, it's because I'm going to be quoting Jim Wilson quite a bit as it goes on. I first met Jim in 1972 when I was an assistant professor at MIT, of all places, and I attended the faculty talks that were held at the Joint Center, MIT and Harvard Center for Urban Studies, not because I was interested in urban studies, but because the co-leaders were Jim Wilson and Pat Moynihan, and it was quite a scene. Jim, with his intellectually careful, almost to the point of severity quality, and Pat Moynihan, intellectually dashing, almost to the point of effervescence. And those two together were really interesting. I remember this was a time when Jim was deeply involved in law and order issues. Every presentation he made was concerning how to think about crime. And I remember once he finished one of his presentations and Moynihan kind of bubbled up, Jim, I had an idea for the title of your next book you should write. Wilson looks at him, yes. How to stop thinking about crime. Well, 7 years later, I found myself in the studious position of co-teaching Harvard's introductory course with him at his invitation. He was always brilliant. I was almost always pathetic. But nevertheless, there he was every week as I delivered half of those lectures, sitting there graciously taking notes on what I said. And it was a horrifying thought when I tallied it up. That man sat there and listened to over 40 of my lectures over the 79-82 period. It's like getting up and singing with Frank Sinatra sitting in the front row. Kind of intimidating, but he never made me feel anything less than a full, equal partner in what we were doing. More than that, there was something immensely appealing about his bearing and his way of thinking. And I tried to put my finger on this exquisite blend of social science and common sense. And to try and figure that out, I've gone back and read a lot of what he wrote. I didn't know there was a James Q. Wilson website. I probably could have saved myself a lot of trouble. There is, for example, a commentary website where they've archived all his articles in commentary. So something like that's very helpful. So let me summarize a few of the things I found, the paradoxes in Jim's work. First, there's a combination of immense modesty and a ferocious intellectual honesty. On the one hand, he writes this. Years ago, I confidently predicted in an essay about the future crime rate. It was hopelessly, embarrassingly wrong. Since then, I've embraced the view that social scientists should never predict the future. They have enough trouble predicting the past. On the other hand, here's Jim reviewing a book by the spouse of a Harvard colleague. Its tone suggests that it was written at 2 o'clock in the morning, when the darkest hours of night produce the deepest intellectual reveries, but not the clearest insight. Many of us have written down our ideas during these hours, but we usually throw them away the next day, when they are seen to be as vaporous as the night airs that produced them. This author kept his notes and published them. Second paradox, Jim insisted, as we've heard, on grounding knowledge in human behavior. But he was not a value-free behavioralist. On the one hand, he writes, intellectuals are not simply alienated from the regime, they are alienated from the possibility of moral reason. They have become positivists, which is to say moral relativists. Their formulations are defective not because they're unrealistic, but because they're arbitrary and without foundation. The intellectual may be especially mischievous today, not because he's unable to decide whether to dream or scheme, but because there is no religious or philosophical tradition of which he feels a part. Another paradox, although he believed in morality as an essential concern in the social sciences, he was realistic and prudent about its manifestation in politics. Just after Ronald Reagan won his first term as governor, Jim wrote this wonderful piece about Reagan country out in California, which he knew very well. But this is the beginning of 1967. Reagan's been in office maybe a month. Listen to this. We must, I think, take Reaganism seriously. It will be with us for a long time, under one guise or another. Surveys I've taken and others I've read indicate that the single most widespread concern of middle-class Americans is over the decay of values. Everything that suggests that people no longer act in accordance with decent values and right reason. Now, I happen to think morality is important, and those concerned about it are decent people, but I fear for the time when politics is seized with the issue. Our system of government cannot handle matters of that sort. It may be torn apart by that effort. Fourth paradox. While studying social problems, Wilson navigated between a nothing can be done fatalism on the one side and the countervailing hubris that said we can solve problems with more money, more willpower, and getting to the causes. Here's where you go. Government programs to reduce crime by eliminating its ultimate causes are not likely to be successful because such causes are deeply embedded in the cultural system, in family structures, in the history of habitual violence. Above all, we ought to try to learn what works, and in the process abandon our preconceptions about what ought to work. We are only at the beginning of any real knowledge about how best to improve the conditions of life. What we should not do is make the emotionally appealing but intellectually empty claim that the question is no longer what to do, but whether we have the will to do it. Fifth paradox. While he was wary of those policy claims that would solve social problems, he was also wary of ideological claims that tried to justify doing nothing. This is what he wrote in 1986. Libertarianism and the minimum state are not viable ideas. A large, heterogeneous, democratic nation cannot be governed on the basis of a conception of the public good that requires for its success that the nation be small, homogeneous, and undemocratic. Telling people who want clean air, a safe environment, fewer drug dealers, a decent retirement, and protection against catastrophic medical bills, telling them that the government can not do these things is either wishful thinking or suicidal politics. I am not a reflexive advocate of minimalist government. I'm simply a person whose service in national commissions and studies in politics have been sobering experiences. Finally, there's Wilson the educator. This will be a little long, but I think it's worth it. For most of us, there's a sense of balance that almost always asserts itself, so that neither the stern and unyielding principles of justice nor the heedless sense of compassion dominates our actions. The liberal education is at its best when it strikes this balance, when it makes one aware that principles must ultimately be justified by something more than mere utility, that liberty is as worth preserving when it's attacked by a group one admires as when it is assaulted by a group one detests, and that the bonds of civility upon which the maintenance of society depends are more fragile than we might admit. When properly conducted, there is an inevitable and desirable tension in a liberal education. Among the best students, the best teachers, that tension is evident. They're educated up to the delicate point where they can be neither true believers nor utter skeptics. And so it should be with liberalism or indeed any other political faith. The commitment to fair rules and procedures often inhibits the solution of certain problems, just as the commitment to social action can subvert the maintenance of those rules. Living with such partially incompatible goals requires, ultimately, the preservation within oneself of a realm of inner privacy, into which neither politics nor society can reach, and where quietude and imagination do gentle battle for the loyalty of our spirit. That's lovely. So, after reading these things, it finally occurred to me what I found so appealing about this. And I guess it's obvious now. It's the virtue of Aristotle's golden mean. I know you all know about it, but sometimes things are worth reminding ourselves about. Aristotle said, in respect of its substance and the definition which states its essence, virtue is a mean. With regard to what is best and right, it is an extreme. In other words, put it in my language, positionally, virtue is a mean, and conditionally, it's golden in the quality of its excellence. As a mean, virtue is not some compromise splitting the difference between two extremes. Courage is not a little bit of cowardice and a little bit of recklessness. It is a human excellence that rises up and between those two vices. Fidelity is not one helping of fickleness mixed with another helping of stubbornness. It's a mean by which a person of virtue follows a single way of being good amid many mixed up ways of being bad. In other words, the pathway of virtue is a high and narrow ridge between two types of error. On one side, the vice of excess. On the other side, the vice of deficiency. Virtues are states of character, the bent of a person, the tone of a life, the disposition towards good words and good deeds. That is what I found in rereading Jim Wilson's work. Obviously, there's an autumnal quality in this kind of occasion. I think most of our panels look forward how we can do better, so I don't mind having this autumnal quality in my little talk. As time goes on, I find myself giving more of these talks about esteemed scholars and friends. First there was Aaron Podolsky, then Dick Neustadt, Sam Beer, now Jim. Moreover, there's autumnal feelings here because I suspect that many of us think we're now living in a political culture where there is no room for a public intellectual like Jim Wilson. Could such a person thrive or even gain a hearing in a world of tweets and blogs and talking head twits? Where's the Jim Wilson on immigration, gun control, on healthcare? Finally, there is a virtue most appropriate to this occasion, I think, that has its own inherent autumnal quality. On the one side of this virtue lies crass flattery. On the other side is indifference. Along the high and narrow ridge lies the way of thankfulness, gratitude. In his book, Jim talks about 4 virtues, as you know. Well, let me add this as a 5th one. Gratitude is a curious thing. It has been called the most pleasant of all virtues, and also one of the most rare. At first, that seems strange. If it's so pleasant, what could be easier than being thankful for what you receive? And yet, in reality, there are immense obstacles to the virtue of gratitude. It requires that we acknowledge and take joy in our debt to others. At a deeper level, gratitude requires a kind of self-forgetfulness, a humble response to unmerited gifts, including the gift of life and existence. Spinoza described gratitude as a desire or eagerness of love, the thankfulness by which we strive to benefit one who has benefited us from that person's love for us. But I think Spinoza's wrong. that was so, how could you or I be grateful to someone who's dead and whom we cannot benefit? I think Epicurus is closer to the mark when he describes the virtue of gratitude or thankfulness as the recollection of what has been. Gratitude, Epicurus said, is the sweetness in the memory of a departed friend. And so the autumnal quality of gratitude as a virtue. It doesn't abolish grief, it completes it. At first, grief is always the stronger. How awful that he or she shouldn't be with us. But gratitude completes mourning with joy. How fortunate that he or she should have lived. How thankful should we be to have known this person. Thank you.
We have some time for questions or comments after those two fine talks. Well, maybe I'll start. Because I was fortunate to have experience with Jim at not only at a young age for me, but his beginning of his work in crime and police. I was fortunate with Marty Schefter and Paul Weaver to be one of the research assistants that did the field work on the rise of police behavior. I wanted to note that, follow up on Peter's comments, that when he asked who has read a lot on American government the most, Jim. And I wanted to say, it seemed to me always, when I knew him as a student and knew later, that it was central to him, to his great work. And I wanted to weave this in with, I don't know, I'm sorry I wasn't here yesterday, I don't know if there was any time for his critics. Well, I'll mention a critic. I once had lunch with Pat Murphy, police chief of New York City, and I think the executive director of the Police Foundation, and Jim was the chairman of the board, and I was at this informal lunch extolling Jim's the strength of his views, and Murphy said somewhat derisively, yeah, Jim Wilson, the great rewrite man. And I gave it as good as I got there, and in defending Jim's work, but I wasn't old enough and knowledgeable enough at that time to say it in the broad way that I would have, and I've thought about it in terms of this conference. I've in the last few years I've taught, as well as my public policy work, a course on politics and the novel, and most recently Shakespeare and political leadership. So what I would have said to Pat Murphy, that Jim Wilson was a great rewrite man, like Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, and like William Shakespeare. He took good work and made it greater. He took the broken windows. He didn't, that was someone else's study. He took it and brought it into a policy area. He took George Kellering's work in Newark and others and developed it more greatly. I've been thinking about this because I'll add now, was writing a piece on the dynamics of epistemology about Thomas Jefferson and Shakespeare, but I'll add Jim now. And I think he belongs there. My experience of rise of police behavior, it wasn't based on anything. It was complete seat of the pants phenomenology. He had written a small piece, he gave us some suggestions, and he said, go out there and look. And I did the piece, I did two pieces only, one, everyone I think did two, not all appeared, and one on a working class suburb of Chicago, Waukegan, filled with disorder, and a suburb, Highland Park, and showed that it was not what later became known as the service department, but highly professionalized. And Jim, being a great social scientist, didn't believe me. And he flew out to Chicago to look for himself. He came back and he said, typical of him, you're right. Nothing more, nothing less. That was good enough for me. I think it was one of the best pieces of work I ever did. I was too young to, I didn't think of theory. I was a seat of the pants phenomenologist. So I think that that's a way of understanding his work, its greatness, and understanding for our students and ourselves. I think Aaron Wildowski was a great reader, as Hugh referred to, and that's one of the things that I have learned from you. Other comments? Yes, Mark?
Listening to Peter Schuck, listening to the sectors in which America is exceptional, something struck me that had struck me before, maybe obvious to everybody else, that there's another domain of intellectual life other than religion, where ferocious competition has led to leadership, and that's higher education. I think by last count, 46 of the 50 leading universities in the world are in the United States. And maybe we're too close to that to notice it, or maybe the hostility to the ideology of the academy blinds some of us to it. But it's really an extraordinary fact. I mean, the EU is as big and as rich as we are, and it has 3, and we've got 45. That's, I think, fairly astounding and deserves some comment.
Well, I completely agree with you. The chapter in the book by Paul Peterson emphasizes that. Some of it's about higher education, some of it's about elementary and secondary, but of course you're right. And up until very recently, that's been true of other research institutions. I think it's still true, but there's some concern that our research infrastructure may be suffering some decline. But no, everything is relevant. It's suffering decline almost everywhere else, except maybe in China. I think China may well implode before it reaches our level of achievement. But that remains to be seen.
So I guess the suggestion I would make is that as in religion, it's the competitive nature of the sector that contrasts with lots of other places.
Including the public-private competition. Other questions, comments for you? I would say, yeah, Paul.
Not sure entirely where I'll go with this, but so I'm American. I moved to Canada some years ago, and one of the things I'm working on is an edited book that compares Canada and the United States. Canadians are always comparing Canada and the United States, and so one thing that's kind of interesting is that there are several surveys with data, attitudinal data from multiple countries. And one of the things that emerges in these, so recall that I said Canadians are always interested in why the United States is different, and they kind of are inclined to make quite a bit of that difference. If you kind of display on a graph the locations of various attitudes of different countries, Canada and the United States are essentially identical. I mean, it looks like almost they're in a distinctive place, different from every other place, but very, very like each other. And then in most respects, public policies are fairly similar between Canada and the United States, and to a great extent, social outcomes. So an interesting issue is whether the political institutions are actually making a big difference or not, because the political institutions of Canada and the United States are very different. For the book that I'm editing, a little bit different point. For the book that I'm editing, Jack Nago at Penn and Canadian scholar Keith Manting have done a study comparing outcomes, various things from homicide rates to infant mortality to measures of the equality of women and so forth. Whatever they could get at a state or regional level, and and I think it's quite striking about this is that Canada and the parts of the United States that are on the border of Canada are the same. Parts of the United States that are south of the border are significantly different, and the Deep South is way different. So I'm not sure what my point is exactly. It's something like that there's some complexity to the question of how different Canada and the United States really are, and what is the role of institutions or the people living in these different locations. It's quite interesting that these differences among American states are greater than the differences between the northern American states and the Canadian provinces. So I don't know if you have thoughts about this. I haven't given you anything very clear to react to. But.
No, I myself am very interested. Go ahead.
Just very brief thoughts stimulated by remarks. One is that the comparison is a mixed one, as one would expect. Our immigration and humanitarian admissions policies are quite similar. In fact, Canada admits more legal immigrants than the United States does on a per capita basis. But roughly the approaches are the same. On the other hand, the health insurance systems are very different. So one would have to look very carefully at the various dimensions of public policy and then try to determine what the causes of those differences are. Some of them are historical, some of them as a result of the fact that we have a presidential system, they have a parliamentary system, and they began with a more conservative population resulting from the loyalist migration there. There are a lot of differences. These comparisons are very, very difficult to make, and one, I think, ought to be very, very chary before reaching any hard conclusions about these things. And Jim would have been the first to emphasize that methodological point.
Yes.
Peter, I guess I sometimes wonder if James Q. Wilson were asked the question of what is the single most distinctive feature of American democracy, that is, of the political regime, the institutions, and so on. I suspect, and this is just a suspicion, I wonder what you think of it, that he would answer its sensitivity to public opinion in comparison with other democracies. Is that close?
I think he would probably say that I would suspect that's more epiphenomenal than explanatory. I think he would probably, and I can't speak for him, obviously, but I think the difference in the political regimes, the structure of ours, the presidential system, the separation of powers, the very strong federalism,
We have elections all the time. We have House of Representatives comes up for re-election every 2 years. That creates hypersensitivity.
No, I think that's true in a number of areas of public opinion. There's been a comparison, for example, of the attitudes toward capital punishment in Europe and in the United States. And as I understand the data, the attitudes toward capital punishment among the public are pretty much the same. But here there's capital punishment, there is not. And the elites seem to drive the policy agenda, at least in some areas, more in those systems where I think the government, by reason of the parliamentary form of government, has more leeway, has more immunity from those political pressures.
I think just that one point, a very good point on the by-elections, the work that we did in Seeking the Center, and the most recent book on the Bush administration with Clinton and Obama. Just look at these, about 1994, 2006, and 2010, the flips there, and the enormous policy impact that flowed from them, and immediately Rumsfeld resigns the next day after the 2006 election. the policy in Iraq. As the surgeons, it's more muddled. But those are, just from 1994 to 2010, whatever that is, 16 years, that's an enormous effect. These are, you need to unbuck because England, Blair, with no by-elections, can continue, with 90% opposition, in terms of, can continue those policies with no accountability. Mark?
Yeah, I just want, one name that hasn't come up in relationship to Jim that we've talked a lot about Banfield, quite appropriately, but I keep coming back to James Madison. I think Jim really had a profound understanding and commitment to James Madison's way of viewing things, and I have to say the only times I've ever differed with him was when I thought maybe he was a little too Madisonian. But I'm thinking of the end of the preface to American Politics Then and Now, when he talks about what he fears we're going to lose in terms of exceptionalism. What he really stresses is a kind of Madisonian commitment to limited government, protecting the private sphere, keeping a zone, as Hugh so eloquently said about, or one of you said about a little room for the private self in the soul. It seems to me that deep commitment to kind of, the key ideas of the framers is maybe what he would have said is the most important, exceptional thing.
Pete, did you want to say something? Again, I wasn't here yesterday, but I wanted to throw out another name much more briefly. But again, it fits with what I'm saying, what he read, and then imparted to his students. I was only, thank God, at Harvard for 2 years. But through, go out in the field. He helped me get, after varieties of police behavior, I looked at multiple cities for courts. And he suggested, but in any event, Simmel, I don't know if George Simmel's name has come up, but Wilson talked about him all the time. Again, so a wise guy like Pat Murphy is a great rewrite man. Did he footnote with Simmel all the time? No, so what? But we learned from him. And one of the things I say this independently, but build on and invite Hugh to say anything or anyone else on this point about the autumnal cloud, but more particularly gratitude. Simmel, indirectly, Jim sent me to read Simmel, and one of his essays is on gratitude, which Simmel called, in a pithy way that Jim would have liked. And he called gratitude moral memory. So either Simmel or Hugh's fine points followed up on. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Peter.
We'll reconvene at 2 o'clock.
And then maybe 8 minutes to 10 minutes responses by Larry, Mead, and Shep, Melnick, and then we'll have some discussion, I hope, and arguments among ourselves. I attempted to try to actually enforce these time limits more strictly than have been on some of the other panels, inspired by the reminder that Jim Wilson at one point endorsed the notion of kicking ass. But I don't want to shock too many of the academics here, and I know that's controversial, and maybe Jim shouldn't have said that, so I don't want to offend anyone, so I'll be gentle and let them go a tiny bit over if they do. We have the papers that are online are by Lawrence Mead and Shep Melnick. Shep Melnick, our host at Boston College. You all know Larry Mead, obviously from NYU. Also, 2 excellent commentators, Kristol, DeMuth, a longtime head of the American Enterprise Institute, now a senior fellow at Hudson, and Pietro, Nivola, a longtime senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and both students and close friends of Jim Wilson. So, Kristol, DeMuth.
Larry Mead and Shep Melnick have written 2 superb papers, and they're filled with insight about Jim's work on crime, on bureaucracy, as lead-ups to their observations about his role at the complicated crossroads of political analysis and policy prescription, and I recommend him very highly. Larry's paper gets off to a great start, where he simply remarks as an introduction that what is most striking about Jim's work is its revelatory quality. Jim takes a subject and describes it in meticulous detail, and one finds in reading Wilson about any particular subject that there has been a revelation, that you feel that you understand the nature of this problem at a very different level than you had ever understood it before. He takes off from there to identify the strength of Jim's work, in part in negative terms. He didn't care about political correctness. He was not a scholastic. He regarded himself as a reporter, and Larry makes the point that Jim actually believed that there was such thing as objective truth, which is a good way to begin. He thought that the role of the scholar was to try to understand this real but highly complex, difficult, hard to understand world out there, that the purpose of academic models and theories was not to create a reality which the world then had to conform to, but simply as a tool for understanding the world. I have a page here that I tore out of my Harvard yearbook from the year 1966, and they have a quote they have an interview with James Q. Wilson, and he begins this interview with exactly the point that Larry has made. They say, Wilson is a scholar who has come down to earth. He concerns himself with practical situations and believes more of his colleagues should do the same. Quote, too few members of the faculty are studying anything real, he says. Of course, it makes for a wonderful group of colleagues and stimulating conversationalists. I want to add to this. My view of Jim's being an outward-looking scholar, that he looked for the problems that he wanted to solve in the world rather than in the library. It was not just a matter of his mastering some academic field, finding it deficient, and finding it necessary to go out and interview people or do field research or whatever to fill in the gaps. I think that he looked for the problems to address in the world around him, and regarded what was in the library and what people were arguing about at the academic seminars as just one of his source materials. More or less important for understanding the problem at hand than going out in police cars to do the fun field work or sending Susie Garment off to the antitrust division to do the less interesting field work. These were all just aspects of the reality that he was reporting upon, and sometimes he found some aspects of academic work helpful. Sometimes he found it less helpful. He says, let me see if I can find this. This is Larry speaking. Having worked on the crime problem, in the crime problem he found that he was most impressed with economists and their understanding of incentives than with the sociologists and their emphasis on norms and attitudes. But then when it came to the study of bureaucracy, he found the analyses provided by the economists unconvincing and the sociologists' emphasis on roles and culture more useful. He didn't find much of the existing literature enlightening, nor did it seem to be. So this was just one part of the material that he would take to understand the big issues that he took on. It sometimes seems, and there's a bit of this in both of the papers, that Jim's choice of subjects was highly adventitious. Shep points out that he said that he really wasn't at all interested in crime. He sort of got in it through the back door. He was studying bureaucracies, and there were some police officers that happened to be on the campus. In this yearbook of mine, the interviewer notes that he is taking an interest in political organizations. He said, "I'd like to write a book about organizations and politics, but it will take a long time. It's not a grand passion of mine, just an intellectual organizing theme, just something that an academic stumbled on." And then he has this wonderful, witty passage in one of his memoirs when he finds himself at Harvard and obliged by the terms of his contract to teach the course in public administration, which he had vowed never to do. Faced with the fact that I was about to do what I had sworn never to do, I hit upon an ingenious solution to give it a new name, bureaucracy. That consoled me while confusing the students and irritating the faculty. So you listen to Jim, and it sounds like he's kind of stumbling from one thing to another. I think that in part he was being modest, but I think that there is some truth to it, and I'm going to get around to that at the end of my remarks. He did take his problems from the real world. When he got into political scientist as a young academic, the problems of the cities were dominant. He devoted many, many years to those. Those led to his interest in crime. It's been mentioned that this surprise event of the removal of regulation of the airlines, which is something that the academics had proven could never happen, interested him with a lot of controversy around him about the nature of regulation to devote himself to that. After 9/11, he found himself studying the problems of terrorism, how terrorists are recruited, how different policies toward terrorism have been successes or failures. I want to point out as an example of how Jim took his subjects, his muse from the world around him, with the one, what I regard as the big overarching interest and argument of his career, which began with his book, his second book, Amateur Democrat, continued through the Reagan Country essay, American Politics Then and Now, and continues up to the last section of the last chapter of his American government textbook with John DeElio, and that is the emergence of ideas as being important in American politics. Well, it sounds like a very bland and mysterious observation. Ideas, knowledge have always been part of the competition for office. It's always been part of the exercise of public office. What is new and different here? I think what he saw as being new, beginning with his original studies back in the 1950s, is that traditionally what was important in political behavior was not ideas, but loyalties. Loyalties to party, to region or locality, to ethnic group or religious group or occupational group, to class, management, labor, and so forth. And what was changing in American politics was that loyalty was being placed by ideas as being definitive, being defining. That ideology, social conservative or progressive liberal and many others were coming to define the positions, the affinities of many citizens towards candidates and towards people in office. That academic fields, economics, sociology were providing the frameworks for thinking about questions of good or bad policy, for debating them, that highly developed empirical techniques from the academy were being used to evaluate, to interpret experience, and to evaluate the successes of government policies. This was a big change, and we know from those of us, I think everybody knows here that's listened to what has come before, that Jim was extremely worried about the ability of the political process of democracy to accommodate this growing role of ideas, and also, as Hugh Heclo mentioned, the growing importance of values. And yet he threw himself into it and made some enormous contributions to how to conduct politics in a world dominated by abstract ideas, on how to take abstract ideas and extract from them such practical guidance as one could. But where did he get this idea? He didn't get it because Harvard forced him to study the role of ideas. He didn't get it from any of his mentors. Ed Banfield may have played a role. But I think he got it from his interest in politics and the fact that he was living in a world that was dominated by intellectual abstractions, the academy, and he was seeing more clearly than others around him that the world that he inhabited was being called upon more and more to settle very difficult practical issues, frequently finding the academy finding itself poorly equipped, or finding itself well equipped, but in practical fact not being particularly helpful. This great idea was something that Jim understood from his own life. It was his biggest research project, but he never thought about it as such. It was something that just kept recurring and recurring in every aspect of his work. And I think when we look back, we'll find that it was one of his greatest contributions. Larry and Shep diverge a bit on this interesting question of what political science and academic research has to contribute. To what extent can we think that there's anything like a policy science? Larry thinks that Jim was a bit too diffident. He was personally modest. His caution held him back from wholehearted advocacy, as Larry says. Larry, from another paper that Shep mentions, goes a little further and says he really wishes that Jim had been bolder, more of a Charles Murray. Get out there and take the research, but also take some big ideas and throw some big propositions on the table. And I think that Larry just puts it down to Jim's personal modesty and caution, but also his great skills as a reporter, that he was so good at going into a situation and describing it in such persuasive detail that you understood the situation to be completely immutable. You had a complete explanation for the way it was, and therefore it appeared to be very difficult to change. Larry Shep has a somewhat different idea here, and he goes through it in great length, in great detail. And he has some very interesting quotations from Jim's work initially in Thinking About Crime. In Thinking About Crime, Shep tells us, Wilson observed that the various theories offered by the criminologists were serious, intelligent efforts at constructing social theories, and while no theory was proved empirically, all were consistent with at least some important observations about crime, but none could supply a plausible basis for the advocacy of public policy. This, of course, did not prevent his colleagues from making policy recommendations. And then Wilson continues, criminological knowledge may be of assistance. Careful study can help one avoid obvious errors, attack popular myths, devise inventive programs. But it is also likely that the most profound understandings may impede or even distort rather than facilitate choice, because much of this knowledge is what is immutable and necessary, not what is variable and contingent. Shep, as I read him, thinks that it's not so much a matter of personal modesty as Jim's understanding that so much serious and true research on the nature of social problems is suggestive of the limitations of what can be done. That policy is not a matter of taking an economic theory and deploying it in Washington, but in making prudential judgments in the midst of variable and contingent matters. I think that is right. And I think that is closer to my own view. I want to add a couple of codicils, however. Jim could be bold. I think that one of our authors concedes that Jim suggested that orphanage would be a good solution for pregnant women. The windows, the broken windows hypothesis is actually put forth very, very circumspectly in the paper with George, but it was the idea that he had gotten from his original research, the policing his order maintenance. He did see an opportunity to translate it into practical effect. His great book, The Moral Sense, understands morality as arising from sympathy. A year after it is written, again, he could be very suggestible. Norman Podhoretz suggested he write an essay on abortion. No, I don't want to talk about that. That'll just get me into trouble. But having thought at great length about the sources of the moral sense, he applied it to the abortion controversy, where both sides had been shifting between justifying their positions in terms of rights versus morality. And he jumped into the middle of that debate, and from his initial work and from criticism of some of the people in the field, came up with a highly specific proposition, which is that women contemplating an abortion should be encouraged to see photographs or videos of of their own fetus or fetuses at that stage of development before they made a decision. Energetically attacked by people on both sides. And I offer it here simply as an example that Jim did not shrink from making controversial policy propositions where he felt strongly about things. Actually, he loved policy controversy. He often found that when he examined a situation, he felt that the contingencies and practicalities were too great for him to say very much at a general level. But he was head of my academic advisory board at AEI for over 2 decades. We specialized in propounding specific policy proposals from as much of an academic perspective as we can, right in the middle of Washington. He enjoyed that greatly. He admired the work of Charles Murray. He loved Pat Moynihan, who was an intellectual in politics, who was of necessity often running far beyond what social science could say. He regarded debate as good in itself. He thought that just like going to the library, reading the journals was one source of understanding of a problem he was concerned with, listening to various very smart people argue about it was another source. I remember a day in our regulation research workshop at Harvard. I think Steve Kellman may be the only person here who was ever part of that. We were all, we were Harvard people, so we were kind of very nice and understanding of government, but in one area after another of regulation, airline regulation or EPA, we were very, very critical of the government's efforts, and Jim just sat there and listened to everybody for an hour. raised his hand. He said, I'd like everybody here to give an example of one thing that the government should be doing to regulate more. And that caused stunned silence. But it caused us to think about things. It caused us a little bit of embarrassment, and it changed entirely the nature of the debate. He could be a very tough debater. I also want to note that it just wasn't that he was called on occasion to come down and kibitz with people from the government. He was called upon to be on boards. He was on my board at AEI, and we would have a difficult issue, and he would speak, and it would be like a Wilson article. It would be focused on the practicalities of the situation, and he would describe it with such clarity that, given all of the uncertainties and contentions around the table, he would describe what our policy should be, very, very boldly. Sometimes going far beyond what anybody else wanted to do, but in extremely convincing terms. This was not a timid man. I was in case of his work with the FBI and the DEA, in looking at reorganization of the FBI to take on counterterrorism as well as countercrime after 9/11. He had very, very explicit recommendations. He was called upon many times in ways that aren't on any resume or website to give counsel on the most difficult and consequential questions of government policy, where what is characteristic of those problems is the fog of uncertainty, the unbelievable need to make a hard, very, very risky decision in the face of very little information. He never said, well, this is so difficult, we don't know how to decide. He knew that we were there, we had to make decisions. He could be, he was never timid or risk averse, just as a temperamental matter. He was very good at assessing the practicalities and variables and contingencies and describing what to do. I want to make one final point. It is, I don't think there's anything to regret in Jim's life. I don't think he could have made greater contributions through anything else. I do think, having observed his, in both as an academic and as a practical man, that if he had been president of Harvard University, he would have been the greatest university president of the past generation and a person of enormous significance. But Jim was certainly, as much as he admired the politician and the practical man, a person who was completely content to stay with the academy. And I do like very much the passage at the end of Shep's paper when he's asking, Henry Kissinger and Pat Moynihan and all these people up and down the hall at Littauer are running off to these big government posts, and he seems very content to stay where he is. And here is Shep's sentence. I suspect he chose to do so not because he lacked respect for politics as a vocation, but because he was so deeply curious about the, quote, root causes of crime, security, liberty, stable families, and decent government. I think that that is right. And here's my third quote from this old yearbook of mine. Unlike many of his associates, Wilson has no craving to put his ideas into practice by joining the government. Quote, people who leave Harvard, he says, usually are people who don't like research and teaching. I like both, very much indeed. I think that at the end of the day, as much as Jim was interested in politics and practical affairs, what he conceived himself as a teacher and thinker and writer, one who had unusual abilities, but wanted to do that work for its own sake. So to use his own typology, he did not think of himself as an executive of the universe or a manager of U.S. policy writ large. He thought of himself as an operator in the bureaucratic world of the academy, who was going to devote himself to the operational tasks of studying and writing and teaching as best that he could. And so that explains a little bit that subjects came along. Bureaucracy, he wasn't that interested in it, but he was interested in using his skills as an academic to study, understand, write, and teach about these mysteries. He regarded, as much as he spent time walking with kings and advising titans in one world or another, he thought that the world of scholarship was a autonomous and important one that was good enough for a lifetime and good enough to be the central occupation, something that could absorb the great talents and the great ambitions of this man. And I think that that is the highest lesson that he has to give to people such as us today. Thank you.
Pietro?
Bill, is it all right with you if I'm lazy and stay?
That's absolutely fine.
Too far to walk up there. Chris and I have been very lucky because Shep and Larry indeed wrote 2 wonderful papers, which I urge everybody to read if you haven't had a chance. And they performed a miracle in these circles, which was to deliver these papers on time. So we actually got a chance to read them carefully. And I actually find myself in such wholehearted agreement with both Larry and Shep's papers that I almost don't know what to add, except for a few quibbles and observations. But I guess since I have the floor, that's what I'll do. Larry's absolutely right that unlike many contemporary political scientists, Jim Wilson tackled momentous problems. And I agree with Larry that the reasons for why the profession doesn't do enough of that these days has to do in part with political correctness. I mean, can you imagine any Irishman, James Quinn Wilson, for example, in this day and age, writing a book with the title Negro Politics? Anyway, and the other thing that Larry points out is that the profession is scholastic, which I think is exactly the right word for it, because weren't the scholastics the people who debated how many angels danced on the head of a pin? So that's good. I also agree with Larry that Jim, in some ways, more than Ed Banfield, was an empiricist more than a theorizer, and that his methodology tended to be eclectic and hands-on, more that like, if you will, an anthropologist, certainly, than a mathematical model maker. Larry's right as well that political science these days, at least in the academy, although not so much in Washington think tanks, is that it tends to be a little bit too disconnected from the political real world. And Jim was totally the opposite. He was a sharp observer of reality from the ground up. We all know that. Unlike most political scientists, Jim did do what Larry calls some sorties into government itself. And that certainly shows in his understanding of what goes on, what went on. Last, I too found in my work with Jim and my friendship with Jim that he tended to be quite reluctant to propose policy recommendations. I kind of agree with Larry on that. But with an important qualification, which I'll come back to in a minute. And I think Larry's explanations for this are right. Jim tended to be, as most political scientists are, deferential to the democratic process, and in particular to sort of the constraints of the Madisonian system. And he was, let's face it, basically a neoconservative, meaning that he was influenced, I think, by watching, witnessing the Great Society get mugged by reality. I think there's little question. I mean, I thought Mark Kleinman's great examples earlier this morning are taken seriously, but and I also agree with Hugh Heclo that Jim certainly was no libertarian. But I think there's no question that Jim tended to be skeptical that government policy could solve a whole lot of problems. James Q. Wilson was keenly conscious also of the limitations of social science for policymaking purposes. Social science often doesn't get to the bottom of what ails society, and in any case, as Larry points out, social science, the best social science, tends to be retrospective, whereas policy analysis tends to be by nature prospective, and it implies looking into a crystal ball, which is something that Jim Wilson didn't usually like to do. So is there anything to add to these insights? I think there are a few things one can. For one thing, although Wilson may have seemed to despair of getting to the underlying causes of social pathologies like crime, the fact is that he nonetheless spent a heck of a lot of time looking at those root causes. And this is where Shep comes in. He points out that, you know, that after all is what his tone with Richard Herrnstein was all about, his book on crime with Herrnstein. And I might add, actually, that even in thinking about crime, which is the book where he, you know, classically said, I have yet to see a root cause, or however, what the quote was, I have yet to see a root cause. He devotes, in the front of that book, quite a few pages to explaining the crime wave of the 1960s in terms of a simple demographic fact, which was a huge bulge of young people. And he quotes a Princeton demographer who calls that bulge an invasion of barbarians. That wasn't Jim's words, but that was the Princeton guy's words. But Wilson, of course, does not say that this demographic factor is the full explanation for the heightened crime and delinquency of that era, but he emphasizes, and these are his words, that it was of paramount importance. So while Wilson could be cautious about the practical utility of social science and about being prescriptive on the basis of it, it was not for want of examining, to the extent possible, causes and effects. And I'll actually go a step further. To say that Jim Wilson tended to be reluctant to propose policies, or a lot of policies, is decidedly not to say that his work lacked policy implications, and that's really the thrust of Shep's paper. That is very simple. At the end of the day, any policy, any adopted policy, has to be implemented. It has to be administered. And how administrators carry it out is the bottom line. It's where the rubber meets the road. Jim was not the only scholar, obviously, to stress this. I mean, we have Martha Durthik sitting over here, Herbert Kaufman, a former colleague of mine at Brookings, of course, Aaron Wildowski, Gene Bardock, Marty Levin, and many others have toiled in those weeds. But I think that it's fair to say that Jim did the most to clarify for policymakers what they could realistically expect at the end of the day. So let me give you a concrete example, because at the end of, near the end of Jim's life, I co-authored with him a paper for the Hoover Institution, which was on the fiscal stimulus in 2009. And what we concluded was that if one of the goals of the stimulus was, as the President and the Vice President kept saying, to be very timely, it mattered a lot which kinds of agencies were administering the program and which agencies were doling out the money. Agencies like the Social Security Administration, whose job it is simply to write out checks, were able to do their, perform their task very efficiently and in a timely way. Agencies like the Department of Energy or the Department of Transportation, which were given much more complicated assignments, such as building high-speed railroads or creating green jobs and so on, ran into much bigger difficulties. And the point is that, as Jim would have predicted, bureaus with straightforward task structures can implement policy rather smoothly, whereas bureaus that have complicated tasks and a lot of red tape associated with it can often make a hash of even the most well-intentioned policies. Shep, I grant you that that Wilson didn't formulate sort of any broad theory of bureaucratic organization, but if you look at his classic book, Bureaucracy, you do come away with some very basic generalizations that are extremely useful to the policy community. Two more points. One of them is kind of small, and one of them a little larger. Larry, I think that it's not exactly correct, although I don't remember if you say it in so many words, but to say that Jim did no quantitative poli-sci. As a young Harvard professor, he definitely paid his dues with turgid papers like this one, in which he and Ed Banfield do some basic regression analysis of voting behavior and found that voters in certain ethnic groups, certain income groups, tend to vote in a much more public-spirited way than in a self-interested way. And in fact, this article, which was in the APSR, has it's a mouthful. It's typical of titles in the APSR. It's called "Public Regarding This as a Value Premise in Voting Behavior." Okay, so that's just a minor observation. But let me make one final thing here, a larger thought. Jim was certainly among the first in the profession to introduce public policy considerations to political science, and both Shep and Larry duly make this point very well. While others were focused on other questions, such as the not unimportant question of who governs or what the distribution of political power is in a regime, Jim was asking, so what? What difference does it make who governs? In other words, what kinds of policy outcomes might one expect from different regimes? And I think that type of question was really a game changer when Jim started to raise it about a half a century ago. And I think a lot of other political scientists have subsequently followed up, including in their own fashion, more than a few quantitative model makers. Finally, I think while it's true that Wilson was not so much an abstract theorist as an empiricist, he definitely made an effort to put the interface of politics and policy into a very accessible theoretical framework. And we're all familiar with the little fourfold 2x2 table, the 4-cell table that Paul Quirk described earlier, the one that suggests how different styles of politics reflect different distributions of costs and benefits of policy, and how they sometimes yield counterintuitive outcomes. And I think Jim would have been the first to admit that this was not entirely an original idea or an original model. Theodore Lowy in a way got there first. But it was Jim that, very much with John Doolio's help, I think, really went the distance with it. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Pietro. And now Larry Mead, maybe, and then Shep.
Well, let me say, first of all, I'm just delighted at this conference. Virtually everyone here is someone that I have cited and read and relied upon, in some cases before I actually met them. So there's a very remarkable conference in terms of, I feel I'm amongst my fellows in a broad sense. In most conferences you want to meet, maybe talk to 10 or 20% of the people here. Here it's virtually everyone I want to talk to. So I always want to have the idea we ought to have organized a dinner for tonight so the thing can go on yet longer. I mean, this is really an extraordinary event. I really appreciate it. And it's an honor to be here because I wasn't one of Jim's students. I feel particularly privileged to have received his attentions to the extent I did. And I do owe him a lot. What I want to address particularly is the point, the difference of degree perhaps between me and Shep on how far political science or social science should try to contribute to policy argument. I think in some ways social science got a bad name in Jim's career because he first encountered it used in policy argument in the Great Society period in the 60s and 70s when I think all the social sciences were quite naive about the problems they faced and where we didn't really know how much we knew and didn't know. And there was a lot of naivete in that early period. And the neoconservatives reacted against it quite appropriately. Today, however, I think it's fair to say that social science is a lot more cautious about how much we know and don't know. And at the same time, we know more. And one of the values, I think, in John DiUlio's paper is that he describes how Jim actually encouraged the progress of social science, or recognized that there was indeed progress in criminology and other fields in understanding the social problem. So we could, why we now expect less, we also know more than we did in the 60s and 70s, and therefore this enormous disjunction between how much we claimed and how much we really knew has diminished. The other point to make is that policy analysis always involves ignorance, and therefore we do it not because we claim total knowledge, but because we have to act. That's a point that Chris made, I think, quite correctly, and it's interesting to hear that in the councils at AEI, Jim was accepting of the need for government to act, even though we don't have complete knowledge. And I think that's how we should understand policy analysis. It is an act, it's a raid into the uncertainty, under the uncertain future, which we have to make because government has to act. And also in this connection, cite two comments by Henry Kissinger. For a brief period, I wrote speeches for him at the State Department. It lasted 7 months, which is more than most people. And in that time, I heard him say two really riveting things relevant here. One of them is that a decision is different from a conclusion. And by that he meant an academic conclusion about what the truth is. It is a more complete statement than a decision. A decision is based upon a certain reasoning, but it isn't complete, and it has to be made in real time, usually with incomplete information. So it's different from an academic conclusion. Many academics and government fail to appreciate that distinction. The other thing he said that was to me even more profound was that the very possibility of choice, which policy analysis presumes, is dependent on our ignorance. If we knew all the facts, it would then be perfectly clear what to do. And then we wouldn't really have a choice. We would have only assess it. So the very possibility of choosing one course of action over another depends upon the fact that our information is incomplete. So I therefore ask your indulgence in recommending that political science and other sciences should contribute to policy argument where essential to government's action. But in saying that, I don't actually take departure from the idea of social science and political science, because my idea of public policy research is actually to link policy argument with political analysis, with political science. And in my courses on this, I try to link the two. I try to imagine research where an analyst will first of all take a position on an issue using policy argument and with the tools appropriate to that and with necessarily incomplete information. But then he will talk about the constraints and what we're actually able to do, constraints stemming from the politics and the institutions, including implementation problems, administrative problems. All of those constraints can be approached with the traditional tools of political science, and there can be complete knowledge, and or they're going to be complete information, research information of the sort that we associate with political science, which will therefore be more complete than what we have on the policy side of the argument. And therefore, we don't completely take leave of academic standards here. On the contrary, we really have two standards. We have one standard of evidence for the policy argument, which is necessarily incomplete, forward-looking, and so on. And then we have another standard for the political analysis, which is more like conventional political science. In this connection, I recommend a recent issue just published by Policy Studies Journal, in which there's a massive study of the politics of welfare in Congress, which takes note of a study that I published a couple of years ago, also a massive study of the politics of welfare in Congress. It took me about 20 years to do it, with hundreds of thousands of dollars of research money and research assistance and all of that. Fortunately for me, the conclusions are similar to those in this recent study. The point is that's high-octane political science by any standard, but you can link that to a policy argument and ask how the constraints limit what government can do. So I think, and the reason for linking the two is to generate new knowledge about the regime. Ultimately, the bottom line is still science, understanding government. The concern I have is that the study of American government has been done to death. It's very hard to say something new and fresh about this subject. And especially, it's hard to do that if you focus just on the politics and the institutions without reference to policy. But when you bring in issues, then there's something fresh to say, because the issues are always new, and they're changing in various ways. And the regime then has to respond to those challenges. And in so doing, if we study that, if we study what government ought to do, we contrast that with what government is able to do, if we get those two connected, then we generate, I think, new information about our regime. And that's the point, finally, of political science.
Thank you, Larry, and now Shep.
The question we're discussing right now is what is the relationship between political science on the one hand and policy analysis and policy advice on the other. To most people, this would probably seem like a theoretical question. But to us, for many of us, this is a very practical problem we have to face every day. How do we teach our courses? How much involved do we get in offering policy advice? I look around and I see a lot of people who publish books with Brookings. And many of us would write this long case study, do this institutional analysis, and then we thought we're supposed to write the last Brookings chapter to make policy recommendations. And many of us thought, I don't know what to say. I do political science, I don't do policy analysis. So in order to help me think about this, I thought, well, who could give the best advice on what the relationship between these things is? And obviously it's James Q. Wilson, because he was the best political scientist of his era, and he was the best policy analyst of his era. But when you look back on his career, you find these enduring tensions. I'll just mention a couple of them. First, one that struck me most directly was, here's a student at Banfield who is extremely distrustful of the amateur ethos, very distrustful of policy intellectuals, who has extolled the virtues of the old politics that we talked about yesterday. He ends up on these commissions to study the causes and cures for crime. He doesn't consider himself a criminologist. He figures I got here by accident. But he was appalled by what he found on this commission, and he wrote about it in Thinking About Crime. Because what he found there was that you had lots of criminologists who had some interesting theories and some interesting evidence, but were making recommendations that had nothing to do with this. Basically, they were importing their ideological positions and cloaking it in social science. I think that reinforced his view that the dangers of claiming expertise were extremely great. So his original views were reinforced by his experience. However, and this is a point that Paul Quirk has kind of pushed me to come to grips with,
He didn't say, well, let's abandon the study of criminology. He didn't say, let's not do more social science. He became intensely interested in finding out what was good social science. Intensely interested in finding out what was high-quality quantitative work. The second edition of Thinking About Crime especially is filled with this. The volumes he did with Joan Petersilia are filled with really good social science studies of the problems of crime. So he really did think that social science had a lot to add. I point out that he didn't necessarily think that social science had a lot to add about studying political institutions, or these quantitative political institutions. I think Larry made this point. Because criminals are different from legislators. Americans tend not to believe that, but they are, because there are more criminals. They have, and it's harder to study in a quantitative method the political elites who compose our institutions. And they are affected, this is a very cool study, they are affected by the institutions of which they become members. So here's another tension. Chris read the famous statement about, I've never seen a root cause of crime. And Jim's argument there was, sociologists have studied the root problems of crime. If you go down, you keep going down, and you find that there are things that are virtually impossible to change. So he said, let's focus on those things that we can change, which are the immediate incentives. And he never, I don't think he ever changed his position on that. However, his attention did change. So he spent the next 10, 15, 20 years studying the root causes of crime. And that didn't necessarily have policy implications immediately, but that was a passion of his to understand the root causes of crime, because that meant, above all, understanding the nature, understanding the essential elements of human nature. A third tension, I think, appears in bureaucracy. He starts off with this statement that is partly facetious, I think, where he says, those people who are looking for a theory of bureaucracy won't find it here. This is not a theoretical book. Of course, it's not a very practical one either. You can't look at a practical advice. He explained why there was no theory of bureaucracy. We talked about some of these things in the past. That the essential element of bureaucracy is the task. And there are so many tasks and that they're so different that when you try to generalize, you end up with hopeless abstractions that aren't any help to anyone. So theory is difficult, but practice, he really found it difficult to say, here are the things that managers must do, because the management tasks are different, public and private, for reasons Steve mentioned earlier, what type of organization is. Now, I think Pietro is absolutely right. If you if a manager or an executive or even an operator reads these books, there are all kinds of things they can learn. You can learn the importance of constraints. You can learn to figure out what kind of organization you're in. You can find out the difficulty of measuring what the operators are doing and observing what they're doing. So all kinds of important things. But here's the point I want to get to, which I think there was in his work, a profound understanding of the separate realm of practical wisdom, of prudence. They could be informed by social science. Of course, it can be most informed by social science that shows what doesn't work. Because that, he says, is what social science are best at. Trying something, evaluating to see if it works, and tell you if it doesn't work, which he says does not make social scientists very popular among politicians, because they're always saying what doesn't work. Chris read a statement from Thinking About Crimes. I just want to read one statement, because I think, to me, it really helped to understand his understanding of the relationship between prudence and social science. He said, it's also likely that the more profound understanding may impede or even distort, the more profound understanding of crime, the human causes of it, may impede or even distort rather than facilitate choices, because much of that knowledge of social science, that is of what is immutable and necessary and not what is variable and contingent. that policy advice, you need to know what we can change, and the deepest form of human knowledge, social science, is about what we can't change. Now it strikes me that tension is throughout his work, and the reason I don't think he resolved it is because it can't be resolved. There are two versions of this, and one version, like Steve Kelman, I was a social studies major at Harvard who was mugged by Gov 150. And so one version of this is Weber. Well, there's science as a vocation, and there's politics as a vocation. They are both admirable endeavors, but they are different. But behind that, behind Weber's understanding, is the understanding of the fact-value distinction. And that's been brought up before. And actually, I disagree. Mark Landy mentioned it, Mark Moore mentioned it. I don't think actually that was, for Jim, the central element, not the fact-value distinction, because he saw values as central to human life and to what social science does. I think that the distinction was a more Aristotelian one, which is that there are realms of contemplation and realms of action, that they are related, but they are not the same thing. And I think this is highly speculative. I don't usually engage in such speculation, but we were at an event like this a few months ago, and Bill's mother asked me the question that Hugh asked before: what was the relationship between the work of James Q. Wilson and Leo Strauss? I have no idea what the answer to that is, other than to suggest that I think that in some way he was led maybe by Ed Banfield, maybe by Harvey Mansfield, maybe just by common sense, to reject the modern notion of science as being involving the ability to control human events. That there was a more traditional, older understanding of the virtues of the contemplative life that is not involving control of action. And it strikes me that throughout his work, he was really interested in two different sets of things, and he didn't expect that they were going to be closely linked. One was understanding the deepest level, what is human nature? And on the other level, what are some of the things we can do as a practical matter that are going to make life in this country and in other decent countries better? And so I would say that most of what he was doing is trying to both protect and to inform the realm of practical wisdom, which he did not want to see swamped by social science, but he thought could be informed by social science, both in the sense of individual studies that tells us what works and what doesn't, but also in a broader sense of educating people about the nature of liberal democracy, the nature of our own regime, and the limits on the actions of politicians.
Maybe I'll just say a word and have a full discussion. And so I was struck by the discussion of Gov 150, which was the bureaucracy course at Harvard, when I guess we were Steve and Chris and Shep and I were there in slightly different years. I took Gov 150 as I can't remember, freshman or sophomore. That was the book. As Jim was writing the book, I guess he taught the course. And I don't know that I didn't fully understand it, certainly, but I memorized the lectures and did okay in the course. But I didn't fall into that camp. I mean, I at the same time was taking a tutorial on Plato and Nietzsche, and somehow found that more entrancing, and went down the field of political theory for a while. I ended up teaching political theory, and I did worked a little with Jim, at the highest regard for him, obviously, but he wasn't an advisor of mine or anything. I think he was the third advisor of my dissertation, and was extremely gracious by skimming it and deciding it was adequate, giving me my degree so I could get my teaching job. I did help on his textbook that he was doing. I think it was 76, 77, I want to say, the 70s, first edition, and he had various grad students write memos for him on what sort of would be the basis, he claimed, for the chapters he would write on each of the different institutions or parties, executive, judiciary. And I don't think there was anyone good on the practical side of the department, I guess, at that time. I'm not offending anyone who was there doing the judiciary, but he asked me to do that, even though I was primarily in political theory, but I had a common law, subfield. and I wrote, and I did end up doing my dissertation on partly on the Federalist Papers on the judiciary, and I wrote him this memo that was full of what I thought were quite thought-provoking, interesting discussion of somewhat exotic topics like standing and the case of controversy requirement. It's so revealing about the American regime because it's so an indirect way to have the courts intervene in politics, and it sort of tells you a lot about liberalism, private and public, and how the standing has changed over the last 40 years. It's self-revealing of something, and I gave it to Jim, who politely read it, said it was really pretty interesting, and didn't use a word of it in his draft. I assume he went and hired a more competent graduate student to help him, do whatever research he needed, which was not much, I would say. I got the impression that the textbook, company had given him some money to hire research assistants, and this was his way of helping out starving graduate students. He didn't really need any of the help, actually. But so didn't need mine, so I was grateful for the money. But I would say, I never really read the bureaucracy book because I'd been in the course, and I thought, and then when I went to Washington in '85, having taught political theory for a few years, I thought, gee, I'm going down to work for Bill Bennett at the Education Department, and then somewhat adventitiously I became chief of staff about 6 months in, and I really had no idea what I was doing, and I was 32 years old and had been a professor, basically a grad student and professor. So I remember thinking, what could I read to actually get some sense of how to help run this department? I mean, it wasn't the biggest department in Washington, but it's still not nothing. And I read actually Jim Wilson's book, and it was extremely helpful. I mean, I'm not saying this just because we're here. I said this to Jim later, and he scoffed at me and said, come on, it wasn't really helpful. You would have figured it out yourself. It's mostly common sense. But it really was helpful. So the degree to which his, that book's somewhat, I won't say theoretical, but it's not written as policy guidance, But if you are actually going to have to go help figure out how to run a department somewhat competently and responsibly and figure out what emissions are and how they compete, and it was useful. And then I reread whatever edition of his textbook we were then on, and that was very helpful actually in thinking about the presidency and Congress, even though allegedly I should be, I guess, above the level of the textbook. So I don't think one should underestimate, really, as someone who's been in politics and government, just the utility. If more people just read Jim's books in a commonsensical way without worrying about whether this is an advance in political science or how much it owes to anyone else, and just read them, it would actually be, you would have a more competent and sensible, more competent government, I think, and more sensible public policies. I would say, I mean, in my conversations with Jim, and I wasn't as close to him, I was a little too in awe of him to really be close to him in his later years, I was struck by his deep reverence is maybe too strong, but respect for Tocqueville. And I often thought of that sentence in Tocqueville's, at least in the introduction of Democracy in America, in respect to Jim, that Tocqueville says, I tried to not see differently from the political parties, from the partisans of the time, but to see further. And Jim took the opinions of political actors and of citizens seriously and respected them, but then tried to think them through and see the tensions and go a little bit deeper or further in thinking about the American Republic. He didn't, he didn't dismiss opinion the way social science, in a sense, has a tendency to do, but nor did he simply at all, of course, embrace partisanship. That always means there are tensions if you're sort of in between what I would regard as the false claims of science on the one hand and mere partisan opinion on the other. You're sort of in an in-between world. I agree with you, Heclo, that in a sense it's not simply in between, it's also above each of those two worlds. It does mean, though, that when one tries to summarize his thought or his work in a sentence or two or put a label on it, it's difficult. That's in praise of him, not a criticism, I think. Final point, just in terms of his character, there have been very nice tributes to him by people who knew him much better and said it much better. But I really was struck, just at a personal level, by his unusual mix of qualities. He was manly without being boastful in any way. He was moderate without being timid. He was judicious without being equivocal. I mean, he was an unusual human being, an unusual thinker, but not really an unusual human being, unusual man. And it's, I think, really proof of Hugh's point that this is from Aristotle, that obviously the virtues are not really, halfway in between these two vices, but are superior to the vices or deficiencies on either side. I really think he embodied that both in his thought and in his life. Anyway, but other comments up here before we take a couple of questions? somehow the promised fireworks, the Larry Mead, Shep Melnick showdown, smackdown has not happened because corrupt, enfeebled by the atmosphere of the academy, they're being nice to each other. But maybe one or two of you would have an interesting question for any of my colleagues up here. Yes, sir.
Hi, I would just say, by way of comment, I don't know if this is a question exactly, but a reflection. I teach in a little policy school down at the University of Maryland, and what I try to do in my class is, my course, the key core course that I do, political institutions, and the reason I give that Wilson's work to read, is basically because I think that what I have to impart to my students are, first of all, what I call sophisticated awareness of the problems that institutions pose and that politics poses for us. And then secondly, writing skill. And I think that there's just nothing better to offer students than Jim's work for both of them.
Thanks, Josh. Question, comments?
Yeah, I was thinking, I feel like I've been having this argument with Larry for 15 years. A lot of people have had arguments with Larry for 15 years. But one thing.
He has hundreds of thousands of dollars in research to support his taxpayer money, most times, I'm sure.
Larry's is sort of the most ambitious vision, I think, of what it is political science can actually do. And I don't think any of these things are mutually exclusive, but I think when I think of a couple of other things, one is, I teach a class called Policy Disasters at Hopkins, and one of the things is, again, ironically, I use one of Rumsfeld's rules at the beginning, which is to try to make, all new mistakes rather than the ones that have already been made. That's one really important role for political science, right? I think, my advisors who talked about filial piety, I mentioned Martha, that Martha's, a lot of what she was writing in the 70s were about sort of show why substantial mistakes happen. Newtown's In Town is a small, wonderful book, is a kind of example of that, right? Where it wasn't so much that Martha came to the end and had this big laundry list of things that, the ways you should act, to say, just don't do this, right? Don't do this is a pretty good place to start. And the other thing I think is what you might call situational awareness, right? That if bureaucracy doesn't tell you, well, bureaucrats should do X, Y, or Z, right? But it does tell you, this is good, I think it goes to Bill's point, which is, it's important to know where you are, right? Part of any skill is knowing what sort of situation you're in, right? And that doing well is about knowing, that, if you're in this kind of situation where you're going to behave differently than you're in another situation. That's part of the purpose. We go back to, I think, Dave Carpenter's point, right, of typology, categorization, right, is simply to know that there are different rules, both social science rules and rules of prudence, that are associated with different kinds of situations. And I think that's the kind of role that political science can play that's important for policy, but doesn't get you all the way and saying, hey, therefore we got to do X, Y, or Z and put all the kids in orphan. Right? There's a lot of stuff you can do short of that that's still not just pure neutral social science.
Let me just...
Larry wants to continue the 15-year argument here.
Let me just make a brief response. The reasons why I have ambitious views for political science as a policy discipline is because I see how much it matters that so much of the thinking behind social policy lacks institutional awareness. I traditionally dueled with economists in dealing with poverty and welfare. I'm currently sitting on a committee of the National Academy about incarceration where I'm dueling with the criminologists. And although we have certain differences, the really important difference is that they don't really think of criminal justice in terms of institutions. They think of it in terms of policy and laws in sort of disembodied sense. We're going to incarcerate certain people because we have a certain view of punishment, but we want to have multiple offenders who we do not penalize. We have 3 strikes and you're out, various policies like that. What they never ask is, what does it mean in institutional terms? And if you want to have a better solution than just locking people up, then you have to be able to talk in terms of institutions. That's why one of the best things about this conference is I get to talk with David Kennedy about ceasefire, to Mark Kleiman about Project Hope. I'm quizzing them about the institutions. I want to know how they did that on the ground. And that's what political science can contribute to many, many issues. And it's lacking today because so much of policy analysis is dictated by disciplines that don't have an institutional sense, and they don't know about politics. I mean, in the welfare reform area, the inability of most economists and sociologists to deal with institutions is a major reason why they got it wrong, why they didn't understand the potential that reform had. Now, there's certain things about it that are mysterious to me as well. I don't understand why it was as successful as it was. I didn't think it would be that successful. But somehow, a revolution occurred. I actually staged a conference at ADI to try to understand that. I brought in field researchers to try to explain why it was that the impact of welfare reform was greater than one would have asked, one expected from the evaluations. The opposite would normally happen. Normally speaking, when you take a program to scale, it performs worse than the pilot programs. In this case, it performed better than the pilot programs. And that can only be understood in terms of some kind of political dynamic that took over and carried the process forward. As far as I can see, there's next to no research on that. And if there is any research, it's coming from political science. So I really do believe that properly understood and applied with appropriate caution, political science really can be the master science, and we shouldn't shy away from that. Even though Jim is correct to point out these cautions and the limits and so on and so on, but compared to any other discipline, I don't see why we shouldn't expect political science to be the basis for policy science.
Let me call on Bob Katzman to ask me the last question, so we'll end only 20 minutes behind, which is when we started, 20 minutes behind. But I will say one word, I'm just obsessed with Larry's hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars over the last 15 years, and I do think you should be paying each of us every time you come and ask us a question, you know. Anyway, Bob.
I really have a comment, comment that Pietro made about the usefulness of Jim Wilson's work. If you think about the framework and its applicability to what courts do, what law does, I think you can have a sense of the usefulness of the framework in ways we haven't discussed. Lawyers don't know anything, for the most part, about how organizations operate. They're not sensitive in making their arguments as to how organizations operate. They are concerned with issues of rights, with issues of liability. But then the question becomes, once a court has ruled as to liability, what do you do about it? And what the framework of Wilson does that's so important is it gives you a sense, if you're a judge, of constraints. It gives you a sense of what's possible and what's not possible just by going through the various factors that are part of the Wilsonian framework. And what I've done in a variety of administrative law courses is to assign the work. And when we rate what's most popular and useful at the end of the course, it's the Wilson work. It's not the doctrines. It's not the cases. And so it has that useful applicability in the real world that I think all of us should be grateful for.
Thanks, Bob. That was very well said. Any final, Shep?
Yeah, I just want to add to that. A number of years ago, I wrote an article called Administrative Law and Bureaucratic Reality. I ended up saying, what should judges do to be better at administrative law? And I only had one suggestion, which was to read James Q. Wilson's Bureaucracy. And I teach a law and political science course, and I'm really amazed at how little law students know about any political institutions. That administrative law makes all of these assumptions about how bureaucracies operate. But unless the course uses Peter Schuck's reader, most of the law students don't know anything about it. But I just add one further thing about this, Jim's work on bureaucracy. I think one of the best short things he ever wrote on it was the bureaucracy problem in the public interest. And what he says is that we expect lots of different things in bureaucracy. We expect to be efficient, effective, uncorrupt, responsive, accountable. But these things push in different directions. And one of the reasons why you can't have policy solutions to many public policy programs is because we want different things. And we're faced with constant dilemmas.
And that is a limitation that we can't easily get over, but we have to recognize what the nature of those dilemmas and trade-offs are. And I thought that's one of the things he helped explain better than anything else.
Thank you, Shep. Thank you, all of you, for a very, I think, stimulating discussion.